The courtroom was cold, sterile, and filled with the weight of unspoken power. A place where justice was supposed to be served, where truth was meant to triumph. But in that moment, truth had been silenced, slapped into submission. The crack of a palm meeting soft skin echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. It was sudden, violent, and it left an unnatural stillness in its wake. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others turned their faces away, pretending they hadn't seen what had just unfolded right in front of them. The girl stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat, her hand flying to the side of her face where the sting of injustice burned into her skin. Her eyes watered, not from the pain, but from the sheer humiliation of it all. She had done nothing wrong. She had spoken, just spoken, and for that, she had been struck. The officer stood over her, his chest puffed out, his face twisted with that smug look of satisfaction, like he had just put someone in their place. "You think you can talk back to me, huh? You people never learn." His voice dripped with contempt, his words slicing through the air like a blade. She felt her face flush, not just from the slap, but from the anger boiling beneath her skin. She wanted to speak, wanted to scream, wanted to say something, anything, but her voice was caught somewhere between her lungs and her pride. She looked around, searching for someone to say something, to do something. But the courtroom was frozen, locked in the suffocating grip of fear. And then, a chair scraped against the floor. A slow, deliberate sound that cut through the tension like a knife. Someone was standing. The officer barely had time to react before a voice, cold and controlled, rang out across the room. "Bailiff. Arrest him." Silence. Confusion. The officer's smirk faltered for the first time. His eyes flickered toward the bench, toward the woman who had just spoken those words with a calmness that sent chills down spines. "Excuse me," he scoffed, as if he had misheard. "You heard me," the voice repeated, firm, unwavering. "Arrest that man." The bailiff hesitated for only a moment, glancing at the woman on the bench, then at the officer, before stepping forward. Heavy boots clunked against the polished floor as he moved closer. The officer's confidence began to crack. "What the hell are you doing?" he barked, shifting uncomfortably. The woman rose from her seat, her presence alone commanding the room's full attention. The air thickened with an intensity no one could escape. "You just assaulted my daughter. In my courtroom." The color drained from the officer's face. A beat of silence passed. Then another. The realization dawned on him in slow motion, like a nightmare unraveling in real time. His mouth opened, but no words came out. "This is a joke, right?" He forced out a chuckle, looking around for support, but no one met his gaze. He turned back to the judge, his arrogance faltering. "Look, I didn't know she was." "It doesn't matter what you knew," she cut him off, her voice sharp as steel. "You abused your power. In front of witnesses. And now, you will be held accountable." A shift in the room. A breath held. A power dynamic flipping on its head. The officer had spent years treating the courtroom like his personal playground, bending the rules, walking the line between authority and cruelty without ever facing consequences. But this time, the rules had changed. And he was no longer in control. The bailiff grabbed his wrist. "Hands behind your back." "Wait," the officer jerked away, a desperate, frantic look in his eyes. He had put countless people in cuffs, had thrown them against walls, had watched them beg and plead, had laughed in their faces. But now, the cuffs were for him. "You can't do this. You're making a mistake." His voice was rising, panic settling in. "No," the judge said, stepping closer, her presence unwavering. "The mistake was yours. And you will answer for it." The officer's mouth opened again, maybe to argue, maybe to beg, but the cuffs snapped shut around his wrists before he could get another word out. The sound was final. Unforgiving. Gasps rippled through the courtroom again, but this time, they weren't in shock at the officer's violence. They were in shock at what they were witnessing now, the fall of a man who had believed himself untouchable. The shift of power so sudden, so unexpected, that no one had seen it coming. And as he stood there, wrists bound, his confidence shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces on the floor, one thought crossed his mind, over and over again, like a siren screaming in his ears. How the hell did this happen? And more importantly, what happens next? Hey, family. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand strong against racism, discrimination, and abuse of power in any form. This channel is a space where stories expose injustice, uplift voices, and remind us of the power of resilience. If you've ever felt silenced, disrespected, or underestimated because of your skin color, know this: your voice matters. Your life matters. Your story matters. Now, sit back and enjoy this powerful story. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more twists and justice-driven narratives. Let's get into it. Baltimore was a city of contradictions, proud yet burdened, rich in history yet scarred by injustice. The streets hummed with life, from the corner stores where kids bought candy after school to the courthouse steps where activists held protests that sometimes fell on deaf ears. The city was alive, pulsing with the rhythm of those who called it home, yet beneath the surface, an unspoken tension ran deep. It was a place where justice was promised but not always delivered, where power could be wielded like a weapon, and where a name could either open doors or slam them shut. And for people like Aaliyah Carter, the system was something to be survived rather than trusted. At 17, Aaliyah had already learned more about injustice than most adults ever would. She had seen it, felt it, lived it. Growing up in Baltimore had taught her to be tough, to speak up even when her voice trembled, and to never, under any circumstances, back down. Her mother had raised her that way, had instilled in her the belief that her voice mattered, that silence was never an option when faced with wrongdoing. But none of that had prepared her for what happened that day in the courtroom, for the moment that changed everything. Her mother, Judge Olivia Carter, was one of the few black women to ever sit on the bench in Baltimore's judiciary system. She was sharp, unyielding, a woman who carried the weight of her position with the kind of dignity that made people stand up straighter in her presence. She had worked twice as hard to get half as far, had fought through the endless scrutiny and quiet dismissals, had shattered ceilings that weren't meant to be broken. And yet, no matter how much she had achieved, she knew there were still those who saw her as nothing more than a black woman who had been given a seat she didn't deserve. Olivia had spent years fighting to be recognized as more than a statistic, more than a diversity hire, more than whatever quiet prejudice whispered behind closed doors. She had dedicated her life to the law, believing that justice could be found if one fought hard enough for it. But that belief had been tested more times than she cared to admit. And today, it would be tested in ways she never saw coming. Aaliyah had never been one to shy away from confrontation. She had inherited her mother's fire, the same sharp intellect, the same refusal to be ignored. She was a straight-A student, ambitious and unrelenting, with dreams of going to law school and one day standing in the very courtroom her mother presided over. But the system had a way of reminding people like her where they stood, of making sure they never got too comfortable. That day, Aaliyah had been in the courthouse for what should have been a routine hearing, sitting quietly in the gallery, waiting for the proceedings to begin. She wasn't the defendant, wasn't even directly involved in the case, she was there as a witness, as a supporter for someone who had been wronged. But in the eyes of some, that was enough to make her a problem. And then there was Officer Daniel Peterson. He was the kind of man who had spent too long in a uniform, who had worn his badge like a crown instead of a responsibility. The kind who believed the law was something to be bent at his discretion, that respect was something to be demanded, not earned. He had been a cop for nearly 2 decades, had patrolled the streets of Baltimore with the kind of authority that didn't need words to be understood. He was the kind of officer who saw compliance as weakness and defiance as a personal insult. And when he looked at Aaliyah Carter, he didn't see a young girl, a student, a daughter. He saw something else entirely, something that, in his mind, needed to be put in its place. It had started with a glare, then a warning. She had spoken up, not rudely, not aggressively, but firmly, challenging something he had said, calling out an inaccuracy in his testimony. It was nothing more than a correction, a simple fact. But to him, it was disrespect. And that was something he would not tolerate. He had turned toward her slowly, his expression shifting from one of annoyance to something darker, something far more dangerous. He told her to sit down, to stay quiet. She refused. She had every right to be there, every right to speak. And so, with the entire courtroom watching, he had decided to teach her a lesson. The slap had come out of nowhere. 1 second, she was standing her ground, and the next, pain exploded across her face. The force of it sent her stumbling back, her head snapping to the side, her vision blurring for a split second. Gasps filled the room, but no one moved. No one spoke. It was the kind of silence that came when something unthinkable had just happened, when the world momentarily paused to process an act so brazen, so unjust, that it seemed almost unreal. Aaliyah's breath hitched, her fingers touching the burning imprint left behind on her cheek. She didn't cry, she refused to give him that. But the humiliation, the sheer audacity of it, settled into her bones like a sickness. She looked up at him, her chest rising and falling with the force of her anger, but he only smirked, like he had proven a point. Like he had won. And then, her mother stood. It was not a rushed movement. It was slow, deliberate, filled with a weight that sent a ripple of unease through the room. Judge Olivia Carter was not a woman who raised her voice unnecessarily. She didn't have to. Her authority came not from volume but from presence, from the quiet, commanding way she carried herself. "Bailiff," she said, her voice even, measured. "Arrest him." For a moment, no one moved. The words hung in the air, almost surreal, as if no one could quite believe what they had just heard. Peterson scoffed, shifting on his feet, his arrogance still intact. "What?" he barked, looking around as if waiting for someone to tell him this was all a joke. Judge Carter stepped forward, her eyes locking onto his with a cold, unwavering intensity. "You just assaulted my daughter. In my courtroom." Silence. A muscle twitched in Peterson's jaw. His confidence faltered, just slightly, just enough for the first flicker of realization to set in. "You think you can do this?" he hissed, his voice dropping lower, an edge of panic creeping in. The bailiff stepped forward, and for the first time in his career, Peterson found himself on the other side of the badge. He jerked back instinctively, his body resisting the very procedure he had enforced on others countless times. "You're making a mistake," he tried again, his voice tight, but no one was listening. Because the truth was, the mistake had already been made. And now, he would have to answer for it. The weight of what had just happened hung over the courtroom like a suffocating fog, thick and inescapable. Aaliyah could still feel the sting of the slap, not just on her skin but deep in her chest, in the pit of her stomach, where humiliation and fury churned together like a storm waiting to explode. She had been wronged in the most public, dehumanizing way possible, struck down not just by a man, but by the very system that had always protected men like him. And yet, something was shifting. Judge Olivia Carter stood firm, her expression unreadable, but her presence commanded attention. The silence in the room was deafening, a contrast to the rapid pounding of Officer Peterson's heart as the realization of his situation began to sink in. His face was still twisted with defiance, but there was something else creeping in now, something dangerously close to fear. "You can't be serious," Peterson scoffed, his voice lower now, tighter. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, for someone, anyone, to step in and stop this. But all he found were faces locked in stunned disbelief, the weight of his crime settling into the air like thick smoke. "You're making a big mistake," he continued, his voice forced, cracking under the pressure. Olivia didn't flinch. "The only mistake that was made today," she said, her voice cool and sharp as steel, was by you. You abused your power, Officer Peterson. In my courtroom. In front of witnesses. You will be held accountable. Peterson laughed, but it was hollow, desperate. You think you can just have me arrested? Do you know who I am? I've given 20 years of my life to this city. I have friends in this courthouse. Friends in places higher than you. You're not going to get away with this. A beat of silence passed, and then Olivia stepped forward, just enough for the weight of her presence to press against him. Neither will you. The bailiff tightened his grip on Peterson's wrist, the cold metal of the cuffs pressing against the officer's skin. There was something deeply unsettling about the way Peterson's body tensed at that moment, the way his mind seemed to race, his breath coming quicker as though he was just now realizing the nightmare he had walked into. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one in control. You are under arrest for assault and misconduct, the bailiff said, his voice even, impersonal. This is bullshit, Peterson spat, yanking against the grip on his wrist, though it was useless. You can't do this. You can't, Aaliyah, watching from where she stood, felt her pulse in her ears, her anger still simmering beneath the surface. She had spent years watching men like him get away with things they never should have. And now, for the first time, she was watching one of them face the very system they had used against others. Are you scared? She asked, her voice low, controlled, but filled with something sharp. Doesn't feel so good when the power isn't in your hands, does it? Peterson's head snapped toward her, his eyes flashing with something raw and ugly. You think this is over? His voice dripped with a venom that sent a chill down her spine. You don't know how this city works, little girl. You don't know the people I know. The favors I'm owed. He turned his gaze back to Olivia, his lips curling into something between a smirk and a sneer. This isn't justice. This is a stunt. And it's going to cost you. Olivia didn't blink. Take him away. The moment the bailiff pulled Peterson toward the exit, the entire courtroom seemed to exhale, the tension breaking like a dam. Murmurs filled the space, people turning to one another with expressions that ranged from shock to quiet satisfaction. Some whispered, others simply watched, wide-eyed, as the officer was led out like a common criminal. But Olivia knew better than to celebrate. She knew how deep the rot in the system went, how many hands were still working behind the scenes, pulling strings, shifting narratives. She had just made an enemy of a man who wasn't used to losing. And men like that, they didn't just disappear quietly. Aaliyah turned to her mother, her voice quieter now, but no less determined. What happens next? Olivia let out a slow breath, her eyes still locked on the door Peterson had just disappeared through. Now, we prepare for the fight. It didn't take long for the backlash to start. The courthouse was still buzzing by the time the headlines hit: veteran officer arrested in controversial courtroom incident, Judge Olivia Carter oversteps authority in high-profile case. Was this justice or a personal vendetta? The news outlets had their spin, the police union released a statement within hours condemning the decision, and social media became a battlefield of opinions, debates, and outrage. Peterson's supporters were loud. They called Olivia unfit to serve, accused her of using her position for personal revenge. They painted Peterson as a dedicated officer, a man who had put his life on the line for his city, who was now being thrown to the wolves over a misunderstanding. The police department distanced itself just enough to avoid direct blame, but not enough to suggest they were truly standing against him. And behind the scenes, the wheels were turning. 2 days later, Peterson was out on bail. And Olivia knew deep in her gut, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The phone calls started. Anonymous numbers. Breathing on the other end of the line. Messages left on voicemail, subtle at first, then less so. You made a mistake. This isn't going to end well for you. You think you can take us down? She ignored them. She had dealt with worse before. But then, Then came the night when she found the first threat scrawled in red across the windshield of her car. "Payback is coming." Aaliyah saw it before Olivia did. Her stomach clenched, her breath caught in her throat. The sight of those words, bold and unshakable, made everything suddenly too real. "They're coming for you," Aaliyah whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Olivia set her jaw, her fingers tightening into fists. Let them try. Because she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the real fight was only just beginning. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, every seat filled, every eye locked onto the proceedings as though they were watching history unfold before them. Reporters lined the back of the room, their notepads filled with scribbled notes, their cameras flashing as they captured the faces of those involved in what had become the most controversial trial in recent memory. The public had been waiting for this moment, the culmination of weeks of protests, media coverage, and heated debates. People had chosen sides, drawn battle lines, and now, as the trial reached its most crucial juncture, the weight of it all pressed down on every single person in that room. It was no longer just about the slap. It was no longer just about Aaliyah. It had become a reckoning, a moment where the city would be forced to look itself in the mirror and decide what kind of justice it truly believed in. Judge Olivia Carter sat on the bench, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable, though anyone who knew her well enough could see the storm brewing behind her calm demeanor. She had spent years mastering the art of control, of never letting emotions dictate her decisions, but today, that restraint felt like an iron weight in her chest. The courtroom was no longer a sanctuary of law and order, it had become a battlefield, a place where narratives clashed, where the truth was stretched and twisted, where power played its ugly games in plain sight. And across from her, sitting at the defense table, was the man who had set it all in motion. Daniel Peterson sat stiffly in his chair, dressed in a suit that looked unnatural on him, as though it were a costume rather than clothing. His usual arrogance had dimmed, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as if he were grinding his teeth. The courtroom was a place he had always controlled, a space where his uniform had once granted him unquestionable authority. But that uniform was gone now. Stripped away. He was no longer the one giving orders. He was the one being judged. And yet, there was still a glint in his eye, a barely concealed belief that this was temporary, that the system that had always protected him would do so again. He had played this game for too long to believe otherwise. The courtroom doors had barely closed before the judge overseeing the case, a stern-faced man with silver hair and sharp, calculating eyes, called for order. His voice was firm, carrying over the murmurs of the crowd as he turned his attention to the prosecution. "You may proceed." The district attorney stood, adjusting his tie, his movements deliberate, calculated. He was a man who knew the weight of this case, who understood that every word he spoke would carry consequences far beyond the walls of this courtroom. When he spoke, his voice was steady, each syllable crafted with the precision of a man who had been waiting for this moment. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we have before us today is not a question of doubt. It is not a case of misunderstanding or overreaction. What we have is the undeniable truth, a veteran officer of the law, sworn to protect and serve, who instead chose to abuse his power in the most blatant and public manner possible. The evidence will show that Officer Daniel Peterson did not act out of fear. He did not act in defense of the law. He acted out of arrogance, out of prejudice, out of a deep-seated belief that his badge placed him above the very justice he claimed to uphold. He struck a young woman, an unarmed girl, not in a moment of passion, not in the heat of an altercation, but with intent. With purpose. And now, he must be held accountable. Peterson's lawyer stood next, his movements just as measured but carrying a different energy, one of forced confidence, of a man who knew he had an uphill battle but refused to show weakness. He smoothed his hand over his tie, cleared his throat, then turned to address the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are not here to put an officer's entire career on trial. We are not here to make a political statement, to turn this into some grand social debate. We are here to determine the truth of a singular moment. And the truth is this: Officer Peterson was doing his job. He was handling a situation that was escalating. The young woman in question was being disruptive. She was refusing to comply with a lawful order. And while the outcome of that moment was unfortunate, it was not criminal. It was not an act of malice, but rather, a regrettable reaction in a high-pressure situation. Aaliyah felt her fingers tighten around the armrest of her chair, her nails digging into the fabric as she listened. Disruptive. That was the word they had chosen. That was the justification. The same justification used time and time again to explain why people like her, people who looked like her, were subjected to violence. Not because they had done something wrong, but because their existence was seen as disruptive. She wanted to stand, to scream, to tell the entire courtroom exactly what had happened, but she knew this wasn't the moment. The prosecution would speak for her. The evidence would speak for her. And then, it did. One by one, the witnesses took the stand, their testimonies painting a picture so vivid, so damning, that the air in the room grew heavier with each passing word. They described the slap, the force of it, the way Aaliyah had staggered back, stunned, humiliated. They described the silence that had followed, the way Peterson had stood over her, his expression smug, satisfied, as though he had proven a point. And then came the moment that changed everything. The prosecutor turned to the screen at the front of the room, where a video was about to play. "Your Honor, we would like to submit this as evidence," body cam footage retrieved from Officer Peterson's colleague. It was recorded moments after the incident, unbeknownst to the defendant at the time. The video began, the grainy image capturing the inside of a police cruiser, where Peterson sat in the passenger seat. He was laughing, his voice thick with arrogance. She needed to be put in her place. You let them think they're in charge, and this is what happens. That girl, her mother, people like them, they think they run the world now. But I reminded her. Silence. A silence so profound that it felt deafening. Peterson's face drained of color. His lawyer shifted in his seat, his fingers twitching. The prosecutor let the words settle before he spoke. There it is. In his own words. This wasn't law enforcement. This wasn't about safety. This was about control. This was about power. This was about a man who believed himself above the law. The defense scrambled. Peterson tried to speak, tried to explain, but the damage was done. The jury had heard everything. The courtroom had heard everything. And when the verdict was read, the final blow was delivered. Guilty on all counts. The reaction was immediate. The murmurs turned into full-fledged conversations, gasps, disbelief, satisfaction. The weight of the decision rippled through the room, through the city. And for the first time, Daniel Peterson had no badge, no uniform, no authority to shield him. He was just another man facing the consequences of his actions. And there was no escaping them. The weight of the verdict hung in the air, thick and suffocating, pressing down on every person in the courtroom. The murmurs that had erupted moments before still filled the space, a mixture of shock, satisfaction, and disbelief crackling like static. The judge's gavel had barely finished its descent when Daniel Peterson lurched forward in his seat, his face twisted in something between rage and panic. His hands gripped the edge of the defense table so tightly his knuckles turned white, his body rigid as though his mind refused to accept the reality that had just been laid before him. His whole life, he had been untouchable, a man who had walked through the system without ever feeling the weight of its consequences. And now, shackled by his own arrogance, he found himself drowning in them. His lawyer leaned in, speaking in hushed, urgent tones, but Peterson barely heard him. His eyes darted wildly across the room, searching for something, an out, a lifeline, anything that could undo what had just happened. His gaze landed on Judge Carter, her expression calm yet unshakable, as though this outcome had been inevitable from the very moment he raised his hand against her daughter. His chest heaved, his breath coming in quick, uneven bursts, and then, suddenly, he was speaking, his voice laced with a desperate edge that shattered the courtroom's charged silence. "This is a joke," he spat, his voice raw and uneven, thick with disbelief. "This is rigged. You all know it. You all saw what happened. She was being disruptive, she was provoking me, and now you're telling me that one slap, is enough to erase 20 goddamn years of service." He let out a dry, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "This isn't justice. This is revenge. This is political." Judge Carter didn't move, didn't so much as blink, but Aaliyah felt her mother's presence beside her like an immovable force, steady and unwavering. Aaliyah's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of everything that had led to this moment pressing down on her, but she forced herself to stand taller, to meet Peterson's wild, desperate eyes with an unflinching gaze. 20 years of service. Aaliyah's voice was calm, but there was something sharp beneath it, something raw and unrelenting. "And how many times in those 20 years did you do exactly what you did to me? How many people did you put your hands on because you thought no one would ever stop you?" Her fingers curled into fists at her sides, her pulse hammering as she stepped forward. "You didn't hit me because I was being disruptive. You hit me because you wanted to prove that you could. And now, for the first time, you're realizing that you can't." Peterson's lip curled, his whole body tensed as if he wanted to lunge at her but was held back by the invisible weight of his own downfall. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" His voice was quieter now, but no less venomous. "You and your mother, standing up there, playing judge and jury like you own this place. You got your little moment. You got to humiliate me. But let me tell you something, this city doesn't change. People like me, people who do the real work, we don't just disappear." Aaliyah's stomach twisted, but she refused to look away, refused to let him see the way his words slithered under her skin. She had spent years watching men like him walk free, had spent years being told to keep her head down, to pick her battles, to be careful. But this? This was the moment she had been waiting for. "You already disappeared," she said, her voice unwavering. "You just haven't realized it yet." Peterson's lawyer placed a firm hand on his arm, speaking urgently, but Peterson yanked himself free, his frustration bubbling over into something dangerous, something reckless. "Do you really think this changes anything?" he snarled, his voice carrying across the room. "Do you really think you won? The people I know, do you have any idea how fast this can be overturned? How easy it would be to make sure none of you ever forget this mistake?" Judge Carter finally leaned forward, her voice low but cutting through the air like a knife. "The only mistake here, Officer Peterson, was yours. And if you think your connections can save you, I suggest you take a good look around. Because they're not here. Not now. Not when it matters." Peterson's mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time, he seemed to truly grasp the gravity of his situation, the reality that he had burned every bridge, that the very system he had relied on to protect him had finally let him go. The officers standing at the back of the room, the same ones he had worked beside for years, were staring at him with carefully neutral expressions, their hands resting near their belts, their bodies stiff with the quiet understanding that they were no longer looking at a colleague. They were looking at a criminal. The judge cleared his throat, his voice firm as he spoke. "The defendant will be remanded into custody immediately pending sentencing." The words sent another ripple through the room, but Peterson barely reacted. His entire body had gone rigid, his face pale, his mind seemingly stuck in the limbo between denial and reluctant acceptance. The bailiff stepped forward, his voice even, rehearsed. "Stand up." Peterson didn't move. "I said stand up." Slowly, stiffly, Peterson rose to his feet. His lawyer whispered something to him, but his eyes were locked straight ahead, his expression unreadable. The metallic click of handcuffs sent a final jolt of finality through the air, the sound bouncing off the walls like a gavel striking down fate itself. Peterson inhaled sharply as the cold steel pressed against his wrists, his fingers twitching slightly as if testing the reality of his new restraints. Aaliyah exhaled, a slow, steady breath that she hadn't realized she was holding. She had thought this moment would feel different. That it would feel victorious, satisfying. And in a way, it did. But it also felt heavy, complicated. This wasn't just about her. It was about all the people who had never gotten their justice. All the people who had been silenced before they ever had the chance to speak. She turned to her mother, searching for something in her face, relief, pride, anything, but Judge Carter was still unreadable, her gaze locked on Peterson as though she were memorizing the sight of him in cuffs, as though she knew that even in defeat, men like him never truly disappeared. Peterson turned his head slightly, his eyes locking onto Aaliyah one last time. There was no more smugness, no more confidence. Just something hollow, something broken. "You think this is over," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. Aaliyah met his gaze, her voice quiet but certain. "No," she admitted. "But it's a start." The bailiff gave a small tug on Peterson's arm, guiding him toward the exit. And as he was led through the doors, his silhouette shrinking with each step, Aaliyah felt the first real breath of freedom settle in her chest. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving the system. She was changing it. The doors swung shut behind Peterson, but the weight of his presence still lingered in the air, as if the room itself had absorbed years of his unchecked power, the quiet violence of his authority, and was now struggling to breathe without it. The echoes of his footsteps down the hallway, the distant hum of reporters outside, the murmurs of spectators trying to process what they had just witnessed, it all blended into a haze, a moment suspended between what had just happened and what was still to come. Aaliyah sat frozen in her seat, her hands resting on her lap, fingers still curled from the tension of the trial. The verdict had been read. The sentence would come soon enough. Peterson was no longer an officer, no longer a man with a badge to shield him, no longer the untouchable force he had always believed himself to be. He had been stripped down to what he truly was, an abuser of power, a man who had spent decades convinced that his actions would never have consequences. And yet, despite everything, there was something unsettling in the way he had looked at her before being led away, something in his voice when he had muttered his final words to her. She wanted to believe it was fear. That for the first time, he had felt what so many before him had felt when they faced him in the street, in the back of a squad car, in the silence of a cold interrogation room where justice was nothing more than a hollow promise. But deep down, she knew men like him never truly believed they could lose. Even when they fell, they spent their time plotting how they would rise again. Judge Carter remained seated, her hands neatly folded on the bench in front of her, her expression as composed as it had been from the beginning. But Aaliyah knew her mother better than anyone. She could see the way her shoulders had stiffened just slightly, the way her breath came in controlled, measured intervals, as if she were forcing herself to remain still. The trial had ended, but this fight, this war, was far from over. The judge overseeing the case finally stood, clearing his throat as he addressed the room. "Court is adjourned. The sentencing hearing will be scheduled within the next 30 days. His voice was firm, devoid of emotion, as if he had already moved on to the next case, the next name on the docket, the next tragedy waiting to be processed through the system. The spectators began to shuffle out, some lingering in clusters, whispering, glancing toward Aaliyah and her mother, their eyes filled with curiosity, admiration, skepticism. Some looked at them with relief, as if they had won some battle that should never have needed to be fought. Others looked at them with resentment, quiet and bitter, the kind that would fester long after today. Aaliyah turned to her mother, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not over, is it?" Olivia exhaled slowly, pressing her lips together before finally standing. "No," she admitted. "It never really is." They left the courtroom together, stepping into the chaos of flashing cameras, shouted questions, microphones thrust in their direction. "Judge Carter, how do you respond to the police union's statement? Aaliyah, do you feel justice was served today? Do you think this sets a dangerous precedent? what do you say to those who claim this was politically motivated? The voices overlapped, the crowd pressing in, a sea of bodies all wanting something, demanding something. Aaliyah's pulse quickened, her chest tightening as she felt the weight of it all crash down at once. The verdict, the trial, the fight that had led them here. The fear, the anger, the exhaustion that had been building for weeks, for months, for years. But then, her mother's hand touched her shoulder, grounding her, steadying her. Judge Carter turned toward the cameras, her gaze unwavering, her voice clear and strong. Justice is not about politics. It is about accountability. Today, the system worked as it was meant to. No one is above the law. And no one should live in fear of those meant to protect them. The reporters clamored for more, their voices rising, their questions relentless. But Olivia had said all she needed to say. She placed a guiding hand on Aaliyah's back, leading her through the throng of bodies, past the noise, past the scrutiny, toward the waiting car that would take them home. The drive was silent. The city blurred past the windows, streets bathed in the glow of streetlights, the distant sound of sirens punctuating the quiet. Aaliyah stared out at the world beyond the glass, her mind racing with everything that had happened, everything that still lay ahead. "You did good today," Olivia said finally, her voice softer now, no longer the judge but the mother. Aaliyah swallowed, her throat tight. "Did we, though?" She turned, searching her mother's face for something, assurance, certainty, something that would tell her that this was enough. That Peterson's conviction would change things, that this was the beginning of something better, something safer. Olivia was silent for a long moment, her fingers gripping the steering wheel just a little tighter. "We did what was right," she said. "That doesn't always mean it will feel like enough." Aaliyah exhaled, leaning her head back against the seat, staring up at the ceiling of the car. "He's still out there. His people. The ones who protected him all these years. They're not just going to let this go." Olivia's jaw tightened, her eyes never leaving the road. "No," she agreed. "They won't." The words hung between them, unspoken truths that neither wanted to acknowledge but both knew were inevitable. The justice system had turned its back on Peterson today, but that didn't mean the system itself had changed. There were still men like him walking free, still those who believed their power was untouchable. And some of them were watching. Waiting. Aaliyah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to push down the unease creeping into her chest. She had spent so long fighting for this moment, for this victory. But what came next? What happened when the verdict was read, the handcuffs were placed, the cameras stopped rolling? She opened her eyes, staring out into the night, knowing deep down that whatever came next would not be easy. Because justice wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, but heavy, thick with the weight of everything left unsaid. The trial was over, but its echoes still lingered in every room, in every breath Aaliyah took, in every glance her mother gave her across the dinner table. The air carried the remnants of exhaustion, the kind that burrowed deep into the bones, that sleep couldn't quite erase. Olivia sat across from her, hands folded neatly, her face unreadable in that way only she had mastered. The news played softly in the background, the volume just low enough to make the words indistinct, but they didn't need to hear it. They already knew. Peterson's face had been plastered across every screen, his name dissected in every think piece, every debate, every hushed conversation happening in precincts and offices across the city. Aaliyah pushed her fork against the plate, dragging it absently through the untouched food. She wasn't hungry. Not really. Her body still felt like it was stuck in that courtroom, like her mind hadn't yet given her permission to move past it. She had spent so long bracing for the fight, for the moment when she would have to stand her ground, that now, in the stillness, she didn't know what to do with herself. "You're quiet," Olivia finally said, breaking the silence between them. Aaliyah didn't look up. "So are you." A small, knowing sigh. Olivia set her utensils down with deliberate care, folding her hands again as she studied her daughter. We should talk about it. There's nothing to talk about. There's everything to talk about. Aaliyah exhaled sharply, finally meeting her mother's gaze. We won, she said, the words tasting strange in her mouth, like they didn't quite belong there. So why does it feel like we didn't? Olivia leaned back slightly, her expression softening in that way that only happened when they were alone, when the judge disappeared and the mother remained. Because justice doesn't feel like victory, she said, her voice low, measured. It feels like relief. And relief is different. It's fleeting. It doesn't fix the past. It doesn't undo what's already been done. It just stops it from happening again. To someone else. Aaliyah swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. You think it's really over? Olivia hesitated, and that hesitation said more than words ever could. Finally, she shook her head. Not for him. Not for the people who protected him for so long. The word sat between them like something tangible, something they could reach out and touch. Aaliyah already knew it, had felt it the moment Peterson had been led away in cuffs, the way his final words had clung to her skin like a warning. Men like him didn't just disappear. They found cracks in the system, in the silence, in the spaces where people stopped paying attention. Aaliyah's voice was quieter now. What if they come for us? Olivia's jaw tightened just slightly, her eyes darkening in that way that meant she had already considered it. Then we'll be ready. The certainty in her mother's voice should have reassured her, but it didn't. Because Olivia Carter had spent her entire career walking the tightrope between justice and the reality of a system that wasn't built for people like them. She had learned how to fight without flinching, how to stare power in the face and never let it see her waver. But Aaliyah had also seen what it had cost her. The long nights, the battles no one else saw, the exhaustion that never quite left her shoulders. And now, they had painted a target on themselves. She shifted in her seat, her chest tightening. I hate that it still feels like we're waiting for something bad to happen. Olivia reached across the table, covering Aaliyah's hand with her own, her grip warm and grounding. I know, she admitted, her voice softer now, almost tender. But we don't live in fear. Not now. Not ever. Aaliyah wanted to believe that. She really did. But something about the way the city felt, the way the air buzzed with a tension that hadn't faded, made it hard. Because she had seen the way people looked at them, the way some whispered their names like they were heroes and others spat them like curses. And she knew that for every person who believed in what had happened in that courtroom, there were others who saw it as an insult. As a challenge. The front porch light flickered outside, and she found herself glancing toward the window, as if expecting to see something, someone, watching. But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the neighborhood, the distant sound of a car passing by. I don't think he's done with us, Aaliyah admitted finally, the words tasting bitter as they left her lips. Olivia didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood, gathering their plates, moving with that same unshaken composure she always carried, as if nothing in the world could touch her. But Aaliyah knew better. She saw the way her mother's grip was just a little too tight around the edges of the dishes, the way her shoulders had stiffened. I don't think so either, Olivia finally said, her back still turned. But that doesn't mean he's going to win. Aaliyah exhaled slowly, trying to absorb the confidence in her mother's voice, to let it settle in her own chest. She wanted to believe in justice the way Olivia did, wanted to trust that the system would hold, that people like Peterson couldn't just slip through the cracks and come back stronger. But a part of her knew the truth. The world didn't change overnight. And power, real power, never gave itself up willingly. The knock at the door was sharp. Aaliyah flinched before she could stop herself, her pulse spiking. Olivia turned immediately, her entire posture shifting, eyes narrowing just slightly as she placed the plates down on the counter. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, Olivia took a breath, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the door. Aaliyah felt herself hold her breath as her mother unlocked it, the sound of the bolt sliding back echoing in the quiet house. The door creaked open, and standing there, in the glow of the porch light, was a man in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. "Judge Carter," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. "We need to talk." Aaliyah's stomach dropped. Because she recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same one Peterson had before he left the courtroom. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The man on the porch didn't move, his presence looming in the dim glow of the porch light, his hands clasped neatly in front of him as if he were a salesman about to deliver a pitch. But there was nothing casual about him. His stance was too rigid, his expression too carefully controlled, his suit too crisp for someone who had just happened to stop by. Everything about him screamed authority, the kind that didn't need a badge or a uniform, the kind that operated in whispers and closed doors, in quiet threats disguised as negotiations. Olivia didn't flinch, didn't so much as shift her weight. She had spent her entire life staring men like him in the face, learning their tactics, recognizing their power plays before they even spoke. Still, Aaliyah could see the tension in her mother's shoulders, the way her hand rested against the doorframe just a little too firmly, a calculated move that both grounded her and kept a barrier between them. The man tilted his head slightly, studying Olivia with an expression that was neither warm nor hostile, just measured. "Judge Carter," he said again, his voice smooth as glass, the kind of tone that could pass for polite if one wasn't paying attention to the undercurrent beneath it. "I won't take much of your time." Olivia remained silent for a beat, her gaze sharp, unwavering. Then, she exhaled slowly, stepping forward just enough to assert control of the moment. "You already have. Say what you came to say." Aaliyah felt her pulse quicken as the man's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You and your daughter have been through a lot these past few weeks. I imagine the stress of the trial, the media attention, the weight of it all has been overwhelming." His voice was steady, the kind of practiced cadence that was meant to lull people into a false sense of security. "I understand that. And I respect the decision of the court, of course." The air around them seemed to tighten. "But," he continued, his tone shifting ever so slightly, "there are those who feel concerned about the precedent that has been set. About what this case represents moving forward." Aaliyah felt a sharp twist in her stomach. There it was. The real reason he was here. Olivia's expression remained unreadable, but there was an edge in her voice now, quiet but razor-sharp. "And who exactly is feeling concerned?" The man's smile didn't falter, but something flickered in his eyes. "You know how these things work, Judge. When a case like this gains national attention, people start looking at the bigger picture. At the message it sends." He let the words settle for a moment before continuing. "There are people who believe that what happened in that courtroom wasn't just about one officer. It was about a shift. A disruption in the natural order of things." Aaliyah's grip tightened around the edge of the table where she stood just inside, listening. The natural order of things. The phrase made her skin crawl. She knew exactly what it meant. It meant Peterson wasn't just one bad officer. He was a symbol. A warning. And now, the people who had benefited from that natural order were feeling threatened. Olivia's voice was calm, deliberate. "Justice isn't a disruption. It's a correction." The man's expression didn't change, but there was something colder in his gaze now, a quiet challenge resting just beneath the surface. That's one way to look at it. Silence stretched between them, thick, heavy. Aaliyah could feel the tension radiating from her mother, but Olivia didn't move, didn't blink, didn't let him see even a crack in her armor. The man adjusted his cuff, glancing briefly at the street before speaking again, his tone shifting into something softer, almost coaxing. "I came here tonight out of respect. To have a conversation. To offer some guidance. This case has already done what it was meant to do. It's made a statement. But now, it's time to let things settle. To move on. To allow the city to heal. Aaliyah felt her jaw clench so hard it hurt. Heal. The word came out before she could stop it, sharp and incredulous. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. You think healing happens by pretending this never happened? By letting Peterson and everyone like him walk away like none of this mattered? The man finally turned his gaze to her, assessing, as if seeing her for the first time as more than just Olivia Carter's daughter. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're young, he said, the condescension in his tone making her blood boil. Passionate. That's admirable. But passion and wisdom aren't always the same thing. There are battles worth fighting. And there are battles that only leave destruction in their wake. Olivia stepped forward again, placing herself slightly between Aaliyah and the man, her posture unyielding. If this conversation is meant to be a warning, she said, her voice like steel, save your breath. I don't scare easily. And neither does my daughter. The man exhaled slowly, as if disappointed, as if this was the answer he had expected but not the one he had hoped for. He tilted his head, studying Olivia for a long moment before nodding slightly. I respect that, Judge Carter. Truly, I do. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, sleek card, extending it toward her. If you ever reconsider. If you ever want to discuss other paths forward. Olivia didn't take it. The man held it there for a moment longer before slipping it back into his pocket with a small, resigned sigh. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And just like that, he turned, walking back toward the black car idling by the curb. The door opened, and he slipped inside, disappearing behind the tinted windows before the vehicle eased away into the night, its headlights vanishing around the corner. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Aaliyah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body still tense, her mind still racing. What the hell was that? Olivia exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face before locking the door. That, she said, turning toward her daughter, was the first of many. Aaliyah stared at her, her heart pounding. You knew this was coming. Olivia gave a small, humorless laugh. Of course, I did. She walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just slightly, peering into the darkness outside. They always come, Aaliyah. When power is challenged, it doesn't retreat. It repositions. Aaliyah swallowed hard, the weight of those words settling deep in her bones. So what do we do now? Olivia turned back to her, her expression unreadable, but her voice steady. We don't stop. Aaliyah's chest tightened, a mix of fear and determination swirling inside her. She had thought the fight ended in the courtroom. She had thought the verdict was the victory. But now, she understood. The battle was just beginning. And she wasn't sure how it would end. The days that followed were a blur of motion, a constant cycle of headlines, whispered conversations, and the weight of knowing that, despite everything, this fight was far from over. The trial had concluded, the verdict had been reached, but the fallout had only just begun. Olivia had seen it before, the way power reassembled itself, the way those who had been momentarily knocked down found new ways to climb back up. She had lived through the backroom conversations, the subtle threats disguised as negotiations, the shifting tides that made it clear that justice, even when served, was never truly final. But this time was different. This time, there was no undoing what had been done. The system had been forced to look at itself, forced to reckon with the fact that one of its own had fallen, and the people who had enabled him were scrambling to adjust. Aaliyah sat on the steps of their home, staring at the quiet street, the weight of everything settling in her chest in a way that felt both heavy and freeing. She had spent years believing that justice was an illusion, that the system was too deeply flawed to ever truly be held accountable. And yet, she had seen it happen. She had stood in that courtroom and watched the power shift in real time. But as satisfying as it was, she couldn't ignore the unease that came with it. Because she knew that for every Peterson who was taken down, there were more waiting to take his place. She knew that what had happened to her, what had happened in that courtroom, was only a fraction of the reality that so many lived through every day. Her mother joined her, settling onto the step beside her, silent for a long moment. Olivia had always been strong, had always been unshakable, but Aaliyah could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way the battle had worn on her in ways she would never fully admit. But there was something else there too, something quieter, something that felt almost like peace. "You did it," Olivia said finally, her voice softer than usual, as if she was allowing herself a rare moment of vulnerability. "You stood your ground. You made them listen." Aaliyah exhaled slowly, letting the words settle. "It doesn't feel like enough." "It never does," Olivia admitted, leaning back slightly, her gaze fixed on the darkening sky. "But that doesn't mean it wasn't worth it." Aaliyah turned toward her, searching for something, some reassurance that this wasn't just another cycle, another moment that would fade into the background of history. "Do you think it'll change anything?" Olivia considered the question carefully, the weight of it pressing down on her before she finally spoke. "I think it already has." She looked at her daughter then, her expression filled with something Aaliyah couldn't quite name, something that felt like both pride and sorrow. "The system doesn't change overnight. But moments like this, they plant the seeds. And one day, those seeds will grow into something bigger than we ever imagined." Aaliyah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She wanted to believe that. She needed to. Because if she didn't, then what was all of this for? Across the city, Peterson sat alone in his holding cell, staring at the cold concrete walls, his mind still reeling from the reality of his situation. The connections he had counted on had gone silent. The people he had thought would protect him had turned their backs, unwilling to risk their own positions for a man who had become more trouble than he was worth. He had spent years believing himself untouchable, convinced that his power was something permanent. And yet, here he was, stripped of everything, left with nothing but the weight of his own downfall. There was no redemption for him. No last-minute saving grace. Because the world had watched, and for once, it had not turned away. Aaliyah stood, stretching her legs, the air cool against her skin as she let herself breathe, really breathe, for the first time in what felt like forever. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But she had learned something in all of this, something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Power was only power until it was challenged. And when it was truly forced to answer for itself, it crumbled. She turned to her mother, a small, determined smile pulling at her lips. "So what do we do now?" Olivia smiled back, slow, knowing. "We keep going." And with that, Aaliyah stepped forward, ready for whatever came next. This story is more than just a courtroom battle. It's about the reality of power, the way it operates, the way it protects itself, and the way it resists change at every turn. It's about how justice is never truly given, it has to be fought for, over and over again, by those who refuse to stay silent. How many times have we seen this same story play out? How many names have we spoken, demanding accountability, only to watch the system find a way to shield its own? But sometimes, just sometimes, the system is forced to face itself. Sometimes, the truth is too loud to be ignored. What would you have done in Aaliyah's place? Would you have spoken up, knowing the risks? Would you have fought back, knowing the cost? Tell us in the comments. Your voice matters. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that challenge, stories that expose, stories that remind us why we fight, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because the truth is always worth telling.